Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time. Not to the gladiatorial arena or the Senate floor, but to something far more personal and universal, your very own home in ancient Rome. Imagine yourself waking up, not in a cozy bed with a soft mattress, but perhaps on a straw mat on a hard floor. Or maybe a simple cot. The morning light streams in, not through a clear glass window, but through a small, perhaps unglazed, opening. You hear the sounds of a bustling city, but it's not the hum of traffic. It's the shouts of street vendors, the clatter of carts on cobblestones, and the distant murmur of thousands of lives packed into a dense urban sprawl. The air smells, not of fresh coffee, but of wood smoke, sweat, and the ever-present aroma of Roman life, which wasn't always pleasant. Your modern house offers privacy, comfort, and an array of conveniences you take for granted. But in ancient Rome, your dwelling was a stark reflection of your social standing, a place of both refuge and profound vulnerability. And let's be honest, you'd probably find it pretty uncomfortable, and maybe even a bit horrifying. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight? And what time is it there? I'm always curious to see how far these sleepy stories travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a city of contrasts, and nowhere is this more evident than in its housing. Rome. A sprawling metropolis with an estimated population of over 1 million people, needed to house its vast populace. This led to a fascinating, and often brutal, dichotomy in living arrangements. Your house wouldn't be a uniform structure, it would be dictated by your wealth, your status, and the very economics of a dense urban environment. This wasn't about personal preference, it was about rigid social stratification. For the vast majority of Rome's inhabitants, the working classes, the freedmen, the slaves, and the myriad of common citizens, your home would likely be an insula. This Latin word literally means island, and it's a fitting name, for these were multi-story apartment blocks, towering upwards, often 5 or 6 stories high, resembling urban islands in a sea of crowded streets. Imagine your modern apartment building, but stripped of almost every amenity, far more densely packed, and built with far less concern for safety. These insulae were the backbone of Roman urban living for the masses. They were often constructed quickly and cheaply, primarily from brick and timber, making them prone to structural instability and, tragically, frequent fires. Imagine living in a building where a fire on a lower floor could quickly engulf the entire structure, with limited escape routes and no modern fire department. The Roman poet Juvenal famously lamented the dangers of living in such buildings, describing landlords who patched up cracks with flimsy plaster, only for the entire structure to collapse. The fear of collapse, or more commonly, the terror of fire, would be a constant companion for anyone living in an insula. Your specific apartment within an insula would also reflect your status. The ground floor apartments, known as tabernae, were often shops or workshops, sometimes with living quarters at the back or above for the shop owner and their family. These had direct street access and were generally the most desirable for a business. As you ascend the building, the apartments become progressively smaller, less desirable, and often more precarious. The higher floors were typically rented by the poorest citizens, with cheaper rents reflecting the increased danger and inconvenience. Imagine climbing 5 or 6 flights of narrow, rickety stairs every day, especially after a long day of labor, to reach your tiny, cramped dwelling at the very top. Your apartment itself would be incredibly basic. You wouldn't find multiple rooms or spacious layouts. For most, it would be a single room, or perhaps 2 small rooms, serving as kitchen, bedroom, and living area combined. Privacy was a luxury you simply wouldn't have. Your family, perhaps even an extended family, would live in incredibly close quarters. Imagine the constant noise from your neighbors, the sounds of everyday life filtering through thin walls, the shared odors of cooking, and the general clamor of a densely packed building. Your life wasn't lived in isolation behind closed doors. It was a communal existence. For better or worse, water and sanitation within an insula were virtually non-existent for individual apartments. There was no running water directly into your home. Instead, you would rely on public fountains or communal water sources, requiring daily trips to fetch water for cooking, cleaning, and drinking. Imagine carrying heavy amphorae of water up multiple flights of stairs. A strenuous daily chore. Sanitation was even grimmer. There were no in-apartment latrines or flush toilets. Instead, you would use a communal latrine on a lower floor, or more commonly, a chamber pot. The contents of these chamber pots would then be emptied into the streets below, or into large communal waste bins that were periodically emptied. The stench, as you might imagine, would be ever present, especially in the alleyways surrounding these towering structures. This primitive sanitation, or lack thereof, contributed significantly to the rampant disease we discussed in our previous journey. Heating was rudimentary. There was no central heating or modern heating appliances. Instead, you might use a small charcoal brazier for warmth, a dangerous proposition in a timber-framed building, constantly posing a fire risk and the threat of carbon monoxide poisoning. Imagine huddling around a small, smoky brazier for warmth on a cold Roman night. The air growing thick and stifling. Lighting would come from oil lamps, casting flickering shadows, or from small windows. The interiors would often be dark, smoky, and damp, despite the inherent dangers and discomforts. The insulae were the beating heart of Roman common life. They fostered a strong sense of community. For good or ill, neighbors knew each other, relied on each other, and experienced the daily struggles and triumphs together. This communal living, born of necessity, created a unique urban social fabric. However, it also meant that disease spread rapidly. Fires could wipe out entire blocks in minutes, and the constant threat of poverty and eviction loomed large. Historians still debate the average lifespan of an insula and the frequency of major collapses or fires, while contemporary Roman writers often sensationalize their dangers. Archaeological evidence shows that many were indeed shoddily built, prone to decay, and frequently rebuilt or repaired. The risk was very real for millions of Roman citizens. So, as you begin to drift off, picture yourself in that crowded Roman apartment block, the sounds of your neighbors, the faint smells of the street, the flickering light of an oil lamp, and the constant awareness of the building's creaking timbers. This was home for the vast majority of Romans, a far cry from the private. Comfortable dwellings you know today, a testament to the harsh realities of ancient urban life. You close your eyes in the cacophony of the insula. That ancient Roman apartment block still echoes in your mind the creaking timbers, the distant cries from the street, the pervasive, undeniable smell of too many people in too small a space. Now, however, you're delving deeper into the insulae, the very heart of Roman city life. A precarious existence of shared walls, constant noise, and the ever-present perils of fire, collapse, and disease. This wasn't just housing, it was a vertical city, a vibrant, dangerous, and utterly essential component of ancient Roman urbanism. Imagine the sheer scale of these structures. Rome, a city of over 1 million people, largely lived in these multi-story behemoths. They weren't single buildings scattered across the landscape. They were entire neighborhoods of towering blocks, some reaching as high as 6 or 7 stories. Think of them as the ancient world's high-rise slums, constantly pushing upwards in a desperate attempt to house the exploding population within the confines of the city walls. The very word insula hints at their dense, self-contained nature. like islands in a vast sea of humanity. The construction of these buildings was often a testament to Roman ingenuity, but also to Roman expediency and greed. While the lower floors might boast sturdy stone or concrete, the upper stories were frequently built with cheaper, less durable materials, timber, flimsy brick, and rubble. Imagine the architects and builders under immense pressure to maximize space and minimize cost, sacrificing safety for speed and profit. This made the upper floors particularly vulnerable, prone to swaying in the wind, and, tragically, to collapse. The Roman satirical poet Juvenal, as mentioned, famously complained about the constant fear of collapse, painting a vivid picture of fragile ceilings and crumbling walls, waiting to trap unsuspecting tenants. It's a terrifying thought, living in a structure that could literally fall down around you at any moment. But the truly horrifying threat was fire. Insulae, with their timber frames, narrow stairwells, and open cooking fires or braziers, were literal tinder boxes. Imagine a fire breaking out on a lower floor, perhaps from an overturned lamp or a stray spark from a charcoal brazier. The flames would race upwards through wooden staircases and shared walls, engulfing the entire building in minutes. Escape routes were limited, often just a single narrow staircase for dozens, if not hundreds, of inhabitants. There was no modern fire department. While Rome did have a corps of watchmen, the vigils, their primary role was more policing and riot control. And their firefighting capabilities were rudimentary at best. Buckets of water and grappling hooks to pull down burning sections. Often too little. Too late. Entire blocks of insulae could be consumed in a single night, leaving thousands homeless or dead. The fear of fire was not abstract. It was a very real, constant anxiety, a terrifying possibility that hung over every occupant. Living conditions within these apartments were incredibly basic, especially on the upper floors. You wouldn't find luxurious amenities. Your living space might be a single room, or at best, 2 small rooms. Privacy, as you know it, was virtually non-existent. Families, sometimes extended families or multiple tenants, would live crammed together, sharing limited space. Imagine the constant noise from your neighbors, conversations, arguments, children playing, cooking sounds, the rustle of daily life kind of filtering through thin walls. This lack of sound insulation meant your life was lived in a constant, audible commune with those around you, for better or worse. And then there's the pervasive issue of sanitation. Individual apartments in insulae almost never had running water or private latrines. Water had to be fetched from public fountains, often requiring multiple trips up and down narrow stairs with heavy amphorae. Imagine the sheer effort involved in daily life, where simply acquiring water for drinking, cooking, and washing was a strenuous chore. Waste disposal was even grimmer. Chamber pots were the norm. The contents of these pots would then be emptied into communal pits on lower floors. Or, notoriously, simply tossed out of windows onto the streets or into narrow alleyways below. Imagine walking down a Roman street, constantly wary of falling refuse. The air thick with the stench of human waste. This primitive sanitation, coupled with the dense population, made insulae breeding grounds for disease. Epidemics could rip through these buildings with terrifying speed. Amplified by the close quarters and contaminated environments, the ground floor of many insulae was often dedicated to tabernae, shops, workshops, or taverns. This meant the street level was a hive of commercial activity, and the sounds and smells of these businesses would permeate the floors above. Imagine living directly above a baker's oven, constantly smelling burning wood and fresh bread, or above a fullery where clothes were washed using urine, enduring the pungent ammonia odors. The line between public and private space was incredibly blurred in these structures, despite all these perils. The insulae were not just places of hardship, they were vibrant, bustling centers of life, reflecting the energy and resilience of the Roman working classes. They fostered a strong sense of community, where neighbors knew each other, relied on each other, and experienced the daily struggles and triumphs together. This communal living, born of necessity, created a unique urban social fabric. It was a world of shared hardship, shared gossip, and shared existence, where isolation was a luxury few could afford. Historians still debate the typical lifespan of an insula and the true scale of their collapses or fires, while contemporary accounts often sensationalize these dangers. Archaeological evidence shows that many were indeed shoddily built, prone to decay, and frequently required repairs or complete rebuilding. The risk was very real for millions of Roman citizens, and the constant threat of these dangers would have colored every moment of their urban existence. So, as you drift into a peaceful slumber, picture yourself in that crowded Roman apartment block, the sounds of your neighbors, the faint smells of the street below, the flickering light of an oil lamp, and the constant awareness of the building's creaking timbers and the ever-present threat of fire. This was home for the vast majority of Romans, a far cry from the private, comfortable dwellings you know today, a testament to the harsh, yet undeniably vibrant realities of ancient urban life. You close your eyes and the cacophony of the insula, that ancient Roman apartment block, still echoes in your mind. The creaking timbers, the distant cries from the street, the pervasive, undeniable smell of too many people in too small a space. Now, however, you're delving deeper into the insula, the very heart of Roman city life. A precarious existence of shared walls, constant noise, and the ever-present perils of fire, collapse, and disease. This wasn't just housing, it was a vertical city, a vibrant, dangerous, and utterly essential component of ancient Roman urbanism. Imagine the sheer scale of these structures. Rome, a city of over 1 million people, largely lived in these multi-story behemoths. They weren't single buildings scattered across the landscape. They were entire neighborhoods of towering blocks, some reaching as high as 6 or 7 stories. Think of them as the ancient world's high-rise slums, constantly pushing upwards in a desperate attempt to house the exploding population within the confines of the city walls. The very word insula hints at their dense, self-contained nature, like islands in a vast sea of humanity. The construction of these buildings was often a testament to Roman ingenuity, but also to Roman expediency and greed. While the lower floors might boast sturdy stone or concrete, the upper stories were frequently built with cheaper, less durable materials, timber, flimsy brick, and rubble. Imagine the architects and builders, under immense pressure to maximize space and minimize cost, sacrificing safety for speed and profit. This made the upper floors particularly vulnerable, prone to swaying in the wind, and, tragically, to collapse. The Roman satirical poet Juvenal, as mentioned, famously complained about the constant fear of collapse, painting a vivid picture of fragile ceilings and crumbling walls, waiting to trap unsuspecting tenants. It's a terrifying thought, living in a structure that could literally fall down around you at any moment. But the truly horrifying threat was fire. Insulae, with their timber frames, narrow stairwells, and open cooking fires or braziers, were literal tinderboxes. Imagine a fire breaking out on a lower floor, perhaps from an overturned lamp or a stray spark from a charcoal brazier. The flames would race upwards through wooden staircases and shared walls, engulfing the entire building in minutes. Escape routes were limited, often just a single, narrow staircase for dozens, if not hundreds, of inhabitants. There was no modern fire department. While Rome did have a corps of watchmen, the vigils, their primary role was more policing and riot control, and their firefighting capabilities were rudimentary at best. Buckets of water and grappling hooks to pull down burning sections. Often too little. Too late. Entire blocks of insulae could be consumed in a single night, leaving thousands homeless or dead. The fear of fire was not abstract. It was a very real, constant anxiety, a terrifying possibility that hung over every occupant. Living conditions within these apartments were incredibly basic, especially on the upper floors. You wouldn't find luxurious amenities. Your living space might be a single room, or at best, 2 small rooms. Privacy, as you know it, was virtually non-existent. Families, sometimes extended families or multiple tenants, would live crammed together, sharing limited space. Imagine the constant noise from your neighbors. Conversations, arguments, children playing, cooking sounds, the rustle of daily life filtering through thin walls. This lack of sound insulation meant your life was lived in a constant, audible commune with those around you, for better or worse. And then there's the pervasive issue of sanitation. Individual apartments in insulae almost never had running water or private latrines. Water had to be fetched from public fountains, often requiring multiple trips up and down narrow stairs with heavy amphorae. Imagine the sheer effort involved in daily life, where simply acquiring water for drinking, cooking, and washing was a strenuous chore. Waste disposal was even grimmer. Chamber pots were the norm. The contents of these pots would then be emptied into communal pits on lower floors, or, notoriously, simply tossed out of windows onto the streets or into narrow alleyways below. Imagine walking down a Roman street, constantly wary of falling refuse. The air thick with the stench of human waste. This primitive sanitation, coupled with the dense population, made insula breeding grounds for disease. Epidemics could rip through these buildings with terrifying speed. Amplified by the close quarters and contaminated environments, the ground floor of many insulae was often dedicated to tabernae, shops, workshops, or taverns. This meant the street level was a hive of commercial activity, and the sounds and smells of these businesses would permeate the floors above. Imagine living directly above a baker's oven, constantly smelling burning wood and fresh bread. Or above a fullery where clothes were washed using urine, enduring the pungent ammonia odors. The line between public and private space was incredibly blurred in these structures, despite all these perils. The insulae were not just places of hardship, they were vibrant, bustling centers of life. Reflecting the energy and resilience of the Roman working classes, they fostered a strong sense of community, where neighbors knew each other, relied on each other, and experienced the daily struggles and triumphs together. This communal living, born of necessity, created a unique urban social fabric. It was a world of shared hardship, shared gossip, and shared existence, where isolation was a luxury few could afford. Historians still debate the typical lifespan of an insula and the true scale of their collapses or fires. While contemporary accounts often sensationalize these dangers, archaeological evidence shows that many were indeed shoddily built, prone to decay, and frequently required repairs or complete rebuilding. The risk was very real for millions of Roman citizens, and the constant threat of these dangers would have colored every moment of their urban existence. So, as you drift into a peaceful slumber, picture yourself in that crowded Roman apartment block, the sounds of your neighbors, the faint smells of the street below, the flickering light of an oil lamp, and the constant awareness of the building's creaking timbers and the ever-present threat of fire. This was home for the vast majority of Romans, a far cry from the private. Comfortable dwellings you know today, a testament to the harsh, yet undeniably vibrant realities of ancient urban life. You close your eyes, and the chilling echoes of ancient plagues begin to recede, replaced by a more insidious, yet equally terrifying reality: the pervasive filth and the agonizing consequences of filth. Feces and fevers, a gruesome truth that defined health and disease in the ancient world. You are walking not through a pristine marble city, but through a landscape saturated with human and animal waste, where every breath carries potential sickness, And every communal gathering is a breeding ground for invisible threats. The very air is thick with a stench that would turn your modern stomach. A pungent reminder of a world where sanitation was rudimentary at best. And often non-existent. Imagine ancient Rome, celebrated for its aqueducts and baths. While these engineering marvels did provide some cleaner water and bathing facilities for a portion of the population, especially the wealthy, the reality for the vast majority was far grimmer. Public latrines, while a step up from relieving oneself in the street, were often communal, lacked privacy, and were rarely cleaned with any true efficacy. Imagine sitting on a stone bench, side by side with dozens of others, over an open sewer, the stench overwhelming, the flies buzzing. There was no toilet paper instead. You might use a sponge on a stick. Shared communally and simply rinsed in a channel of running water. A perfect vector for disease. This lack of personal hygiene on a grand scale meant that fecal-oral contamination was rampant. Every hand that touched food, every shared utensil, every contact carried the risk of transmitting agonizing diseases. The streets themselves were open sewers, despite some attempts at drainage. Sewage and refuse were routinely dumped from windows, creating rivers of filth that flowed down the thoroughfares. Animal waste from horses, donkeys, and wandering livestock added to the putrid mix. Imagine navigating these streets, trying to avoid stepping in puddles of stagnant human waste. The air thick with the smell of decay. This constant exposure to raw sewage and decomposing organic matter led to an explosion of flies, rats, and other vermin, perfect carriers for diseases like typhoid, dysentery, and cholera. Every meal, every drink of water was a gamble. You might be eating bread from a vendor whose hands had just come into contact with street filth, or drinking water drawn from a source contaminated by runoff from the very streets you walk, beyond the cities, in rural areas. Sanitation was even more basic. Latrines were often simple pits or merely designated areas in fields. Human and animal waste would often run directly into rivers or streams, the very sources from which people drew their drinking water, washed their clothes, and even bathed. Imagine trying to stay healthy when your water supply is constantly being recontaminated. This direct cycle of infection meant that gastrointestinal diseases were a constant, pervasive threat, leading to chronic illness, malnutrition, and high mortality rates. Particularly among children, the lack of personal hygiene, which we touched upon in previous episodes, amplified these problems. Daily bathing was not a universal practice, and even when it occurred, it wasn't with germ-killing soap as we know it. People wore clothes for extended periods without washing, allowing lice and fleas to flourish. These parasites weren't just an annoyance. They were vectors for diseases like typhus, which caused agonizing fevers and rashes. Imagine the constant itching, the discomfort, and the knowledge that every bite could be carrying a deadly illness. Your skin, perpetually coated in grime, was a constant battleground against infection. Even a small cut or scrape could quickly become a festering wound, leading to potentially fatal infections without antibiotics. Consider the disposal of the dead. In times of plague, bodies often piled up in the streets, left unburied due to fear or the sheer overwhelming number of casualties. This further compounded the sanitary crisis, creating massive reservoirs of infection, attracting more vermin, and polluting the air with the stench of decomposition. While ancient peoples didn't understand germ theory, they certainly understood that living amongst decaying bodies was unhealthy. But often, the scale of death simply overwhelmed their capacity to cope. Even the ancient medical practices, while sometimes advanced for their time, often contributed to the spread of disease due to a lack of understanding of hygiene. Surgical instruments were rarely sterilized. Hands were not washed between patients. Bloodletting, a common treatment. involved cutting veins, creating open wounds that were highly susceptible to infection. Imagine a barber surgeon with unwashed hands and instruments performing a procedure on you. The very act of seeking help could, ironically, introduce new dangers. One particularly grim consequence of this widespread filth was the prevalence of parasitic worms. Without proper sanitation and cooking methods, nearly everyone carried some form of intestinal parasite: tapeworms, roundworms, whipworms. These internal invaders would sap nutrients from their hosts, contributing to malnutrition, chronic discomfort, and overall weakness, making individuals more susceptible to other infections. Imagine the constant, unseen struggle within your own body, silently draining your energy and health. Archaeological evidence, from preserved feces to analysis of ancient burial remains, consistently confirms the widespread nature of these debilitating infections. Historians still debate the precise impact of Rome's public works on overall public health. While aqueducts brought fresh water and sewers carried away some waste, the effectiveness of these systems was uneven. Not everyone had access, and the very act of concentrating large populations in cities, even with some sanitation, created a fertile ground for disease. The challenges of waste disposal for the vast majority of people, both human and animal, remained immense, contributing to a constant low-level burden of illness, even in periods between major plagues. The grandeur of Roman engineering often masked a far more squalid and unhealthy daily reality for the average citizen. So, as you drift into a peaceful slumber, let the horrifying reality of ancient filth sink in. The constant stench, the ever-present threat of contaminated water, the unseen parasites. These were the daily battles waged by your ancient counterpart. The clean, germ-free world you inhabit is a modern miracle, a stark contrast to a time when cleanliness was a privilege, and disease was an inescapable companion. Born from the very dirt and waste that surrounded everyday life, you close your eyes, and the oppressive stench of ancient streets begins to fade, replaced by a different kind of darkness, the unsettling silence of the mind. You are now exploring beyond the body, delving into the ancient understanding of mental anguish, a terrifying and often misunderstood realm where suffering was frequently attributed to divine wrath. Demonic possession, or a chaotic imbalance of unseen forces. Rather than biological or psychological factors, in a world without neuroscience, therapy, or modern psychiatry, the torment of the mind was often a lonely, terrifying, and profoundly isolating experience. Imagine experiencing overwhelming sadness, anxiety, or hearing voices in a society that has no concept of depression, schizophrenia, or PTSD. For the ancients, such profound mental distress was often interpreted through a supernatural lens. If you suddenly exhibited erratic behavior, spoke in tongues, or suffered from profound melancholia, you might be seen as possessed by a demon or evil spirit. This wasn't a metaphor, it was a literal belief. Imagine the terror of feeling your own mind turn against you, and then being told that an unseen entity had taken control. Treatments might involve exorcisms, elaborate rituals, incantations, or the use of potent, often toxic, herbs designed to drive out the malevolent force. The unfortunate individual might be shackled, isolated, or even subjected to physical abuse in an attempt to beat the demon out of them. There was no gentle understanding, no talk therapy, just fear and desperate attempts to expel the perceived evil. Alternatively, mental illness could be attributed to divine punishment or the displeasure of the gods. If you were afflicted with profound despair, sudden fits, or visions, it might be seen as a sign that you had offended a deity. Imagine being consumed by guilt and terror, convinced that your suffering was a direct consequence of some unknown transgression against Olympus or the heavens. This belief system would often lead to desperate pleas for divine intervention. sacrifices to appease angry gods, or pilgrimages to sacred healing sites, hoping for a miraculous cure. The weight of such spiritual judgment would only deepen the individual's anguish, adding a layer of existential dread to their already tormented mind. The Greeks, particularly figures like Hippocrates, did begin to move towards a more naturalistic understanding of mental illness, connecting it to the theory of the four humors blood: phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Melancholia, what we might call depression, was believed to be caused by an excess of black bile. Mania, hyperactivity, or delusions might be attributed to an excess of yellow bile. While this was a significant step away from purely supernatural explanations, it was still far from a modern understanding. Treatments, therefore, focused on rebalancing these humors through methods like bloodletting, purging inducing vomiting or diarrhea, changes in diet, or herbal remedies. Imagine feeling profoundly depressed, and a physician prescribes bleeding as a cure, based on the color of your tongue. While some of these treatments might have had a temporary placebo effect, they often weakened the patient or had no true impact on the underlying condition. For conditions like epilepsy, often characterized by dramatic seizures, the ancient world had a particularly complex understanding. It was frequently called the sacred disease, believed to be a direct intervention from the gods, either as a divine gift or a terrifying curse. Sufferers might be revered as prophets or feared as demon-haunted. Imagine experiencing these violent, uncontrollable convulsions, falling to the ground, frothing at the mouth, and awakening to find yourself the object of awe, fear, or profound pity. The stigma associated with such overt neurological conditions could be immense, leading to social isolation and a life on the margins. Historians still debate the extent to which epilepsy was seen as a purely sacred disease versus a physical ailment. While Hippocrates famously argued for a naturalistic explanation, popular belief and religious interpretations often persisted, creating a dichotomy in how sufferers were perceived and treated. The concept of trauma as a psychological wound was largely unrecognized. Soldiers returning from brutal wars, slaves enduring horrific abuse, or individuals surviving devastating plagues might suffer from what we now recognize as PTSD or severe anxiety disorders. But in the ancient world, there was no framework for understanding such invisible scars. Their symptoms: insomnia, nightmares, sudden outbursts. Profound withdrawal might be dismissed as weakness, cowardice, or yet another form of demonic influence. Imagine surviving unthinkable horrors, only to find your own mind betraying you, with no one to understand or validate your suffering, no one to offer solace beyond religious platitudes or physical remedies. Even more common forms of mental distress, like grief, severe anxiety, or profound stress, were viewed differently, while certainly acknowledged as painful human experiences. There was less emphasis on prolonged emotional processing or psychological support. Instead, emphasis was often placed on resilience, stoicism, or religious acceptance. The idea of talking through your problems with a trained professional was an alien concept. Your solace would come from family, community, or religious rituals, which, while sometimes comforting, lacked the targeted intervention of modern therapy. One particularly horrifying aspect was the treatment of those deemed mad. Without any understanding of neurobiology, individuals suffering from severe psychoses or uncontrolled behaviors were often feared and subjected to brutal, often inhumane, treatment. They might be chained, confined in dark cells, or subjected to purification rituals that amounted to torture. The aim was not to cure, but to control or expel the perceived evil. Imagine being completely lost within your own mind, your reality fractured, and then being treated as an animal or a vessel for malevolent forces. Stripped of your dignity and basic human rights, The vastness of the ancient world meant that approaches to mental illness varied greatly. In some cultures, shamans or spiritual healers might offer a more sympathetic and integrated approach, viewing mental distress as a spiritual imbalance to be harmonized rather than an evil to be purged. In others, particularly within highly rationalistic philosophical traditions, psychological suffering might be seen as a failing of reason, to be overcome through logic and self-discipline. But universally, the individual suffering was immense, and the tools for genuine relief were heartbreakingly limited. So, as you drift into a peaceful slumber, let your mind ponder the silent, often invisible, torment of the ancient mind, the fear of demons, the weight of divine displeasure, the crude attempts to rebalance humors. These were the only frameworks for understanding a suffering that ran deeper than flesh and bone. The compassion, the understanding, and the scientific insights into mental health that we possess today are truly a beacon of progress. A stark contrast to a time when mental anguish was a terrifying, isolating curse. You close your eyes and the chilling echoes of mental anguish fade, replaced by the faint, fragile cry of a newborn. You are now confronting one of the most heartbreaking realities of the ancient world. Childhood was a constant gamble, a precarious journey where surviving infancy was a monumental achievement, and reaching adulthood was a triumph against overwhelming odds. In a world without modern medicine, hygiene, or even a basic understanding of pediatric care, the lives of children were constantly balanced on a razor's edge, a testament to both their innate resilience and the pervasive threats that surrounded them. Imagine the day you were born. For your ancient counterpart, it was a moment of profound uncertainty. For both you and your mother, childbirth itself was incredibly dangerous. Without sterile environments, antibiotics for infections, or sophisticated medical interventions, both mother and infant faced high risks of death from complications like hemorrhage, eclampsia, or puerperal fever. Midwives, often skilled but limited by the knowledge of their time, were the primary attendants. Imagine the fear in the eyes of your parents as they awaited your arrival, knowing that this joyous event could so easily turn to tragedy if you survived birth. Your first year of life was the most perilous. Infant mortality rates were astronomically high, often estimated to be between 25% to 50% or even higher in some ancient societies. This means that for every 2 babies born, one might not live to see their first birthday. What were the silent killers? Diarrheal diseases caused by contaminated water and unhygienic feeding practices were rampant. Respiratory infections, often exacerbated by smoky indoor environments and close living quarters, swept through communities. Measles, mumps, and other common childhood diseases, which today are largely preventable by vaccines, were deadly scourges that indiscriminately claimed young lives. Imagine the quiet despair of families who became accustomed to burying their infants, a recurring sorrow that shaped their emotional landscape and their understanding of life's fragility, even if you survived the first year. The dangers continued. Early childhood was a minefield of threats. Malnutrition was a constant problem, particularly during times of famine or poor harvest. Without a steady supply of nutritious food, children were weakened, making them even more susceptible to illness. Parasitic infections, as we've discussed, were almost universal, further sapping children's energy and nutrient absorption. Imagine a child constantly battling internal invaders, their tiny bodies struggling to grow and thrive. Accidents were also a significant cause of childhood death. A world without modern safety standards, where open fires, dangerous tools, and deep wells were commonplace, presented constant hazards for curious and unwatched children. Imagine a child falling into a river or wandering too close to a cooking fire, with no immediate medical help available. Childhood was not a period of protected innocence. It was a rugged apprenticeship in survival. Where every day presented new challenges, the care of children, while undoubtedly filled with love, was often limited by the understanding of the time. There was no concept of sterile feeding bottles instead. Infants might be fed with gruel or animal milk from unhygienic vessels, or even shared wet nurses, which could transmit diseases. Imagine a baby being fed from a dirty rag dipped in diluted milk, a common practice that could introduce deadly bacteria. This was not due to neglect, but a lack of scientific knowledge about hygiene and nutrition, education, for the vast majority of children, began almost as soon as they could walk. Childhood was not a prolonged period of academic learning, but a rapid entry into the world of work and responsibility for peasant children. This meant learning essential agricultural skills from their parents, gathering firewood, herding animals, helping in the fields, or assisting with household chores. Girls would learn domestic skills like spinning, weaving, and cooking from their mothers. Boys would follow their fathers into the fields or learn a trade. Play was often intertwined with learning, mimicking adult activities. There were no specific schools for the masses, and literacy was a rare skill, reserved for the privileged few or those destined for religious life. Imagine a childhood where your toys were sticks and stones, and your classroom was the harsh reality of daily labor. For the children of the elite, life was different, but still demanding. They might have tutors, learning reading, writing, and arithmetic. Boys were trained in martial arts, rhetoric, and governance, preparing them for leadership roles. Girls learned household management, music, and the social graces necessary for advantageous marriages. While they had more comforts and intellectual stimulation, their childhoods were still structured apprenticeships, preparing them for the specific roles dictated by their noble birth. They were often betrothed at a young age, their romantic lives predetermined, their individual desires secondary to family alliances and political strategy. The emotional impact of such high child mortality rates on ancient parents is a complex and often debated topic. While some historians argue that frequent loss might have led to a degree of emotional detachment as a coping mechanism, others contend that grief was just as profound as today, simply expressed differently within their cultural norms. Funerary practices often included specific rituals for children, indicating their significance. Even if their brief lives were tragically common, imagine burying multiple children before you reached old age. The silent sorrow etched into your very being. Historians still debate the extent to which ancient parents allowed themselves to become emotionally invested in infants. Given the high mortality, while some sources suggest caution, others portray deep and abiding parental love, indicating a nuanced human experience that transcended the harsh realities. So, as you drift into a peaceful slumber, let the delicate image of the ancient child settle in your mind. Their lives were a testament to resilience, a constant battle against unseen threats, where every surviving year was a profound victory. The safety, comfort, and extended period of protected innocence that childhood offers today is a truly remarkable achievement, a direct result of centuries of scientific and societal progress that your ancient counterpart could only dream of. You close your eyes and the fragile cries of ancient children fade, replaced by the clatter of bone against stone, the bitter taste of strange concoctions, and the sharp scent of pungent herbs. You are now stepping into the realm of ancient remedies, a world of hope and horror, where treatments for horrifying illnesses ranged from surprisingly insightful herbalism to bizarre rituals, dangerous surgeries, and practices that often caused more suffering than the disease itself. In a time without scientific understanding of medicine, every attempt to heal was a desperate gamble, a blend of observation, superstition, and occasional accidental wisdom. Imagine you fall ill in ancient Egypt. Perhaps you suffer from a festering wound. Your local healer might consult an ancient medical papyrus, like the Ebers Papyrus dating back to around 1550 BCE, which details thousands of remedies. Many of these remedies involve plant-based medicines, willow bark containing salicylates, the precursor to aspirin, for pain and fever, opium poppies for pain relief and sedation, or various herbs used for their anti-inflammatory or purgative properties. Imagine drinking a potion made from ground herbs and honey, hoping it will alleviate your fever. Some of these herbal remedies, passed down through generations of oral tradition and recorded on papyri, actually had some pharmacological basis, offering genuine, albeit limited, relief. However, for every sensible herbal remedy, there were dozens of utterly bizarre and often horrifying treatments for that same wound. An Egyptian healer might prescribe applying a poultice made from moldy bread, unwittingly harnessing the penicillin-like properties of the mold. But they might also apply a concoction of animal dung, believing its power would heal, while in reality, introducing deadly bacteria. Imagine the agonizing choice enduring the infection, or applying a compress of animal feces to your open wound, hoping for a miracle. This blend of potentially beneficial and dangerously unsanitary practices highlights the trial and error nature of ancient medicine. In ancient Greece, under the influence of Hippocrates, medicine began to shift towards a more rational approach. Though still deeply flawed, the dominant theory was that of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was believed to be an imbalance of these humors, and remedies aimed to restore balance. If you had a fever, believed to be an excess of blood, a physician might perform bloodletting, cutting a vein to drain blood, or applying leeches. Imagine feeling weak and feverish, and a healer intentionally drains more blood from your body, believing it will cure you. This practice, common for centuries, often weakened patients further, making them more susceptible to other illnesses. Similarly, purges inducing vomiting or diarrhea were used to expel perceived excess humors. The patient's suffering was often immense, and the benefit, if any, was often outweighed by the harm. Surgery in the ancient world was a realm of profound horror, limited by a complete lack of anesthesia and antiseptics. While ancient Egyptian and Roman surgeons were remarkably skilled at setting bones, performing circumcisions, and even some trepanations drilling holes in the skull, often to relieve pressure or treat mental illness. The pain involved was unimaginable. Imagine undergoing an amputation, wide awake, feeling every cut, every saw stroke, screaming in agony. The risk of infection was almost certain, as surgical tools were not sterilized, and wounds were left open to the elements or dressed with dirty bandages. Many who survived the initial procedure would succumb to infection days or weeks later. Surgical success was more about speed and brute force than precision and sterility. Even something as simple as a broken bone was a terrifying ordeal. While ancient physicians developed splints and traction methods, the setting of complex fractures was incredibly painful and often resulted in lifelong deformities or crippling. Imagine a broken leg being manipulated and set without pain relief, your screams echoing through the healer's hut. The idea of modern painkillers, general anesthesia, or X-rays to guide the repair would be utterly incomprehensible. Beyond the physical, ancient remedies also ventured into the mystical. Amulets, charms, and spells were widely used, particularly for chronic or mysterious illnesses. If you suffered from persistent headaches or unexplained pain, you might wear a protective amulet, recite specific incantations, or seek the help of a priest or shaman. Imagine believing that a tiny charm around your neck could ward off the spirits causing your affliction. This blending of medical and magical practices reflected a worldview where the physical and spiritual realms were deeply intertwined, and illness could be both a bodily malfunction and a spiritual assault. One particularly bizarre remedy was the use of gladiatorial blood or liver, believed to have healing properties due to the strength and vitality of the warriors. Romans suffering from epilepsy, for instance, sometimes drank the blood of freshly killed gladiators, hoping to absorb their power and cure their sacred disease. Imagine the sheer desperation, the profound belief in sympathetic magic. That would lead someone to drink the blood of a dying man in a gladiatorial arena. This highlights the extremes to which people would go when faced with inexplicable and terrifying illnesses. Historians still debate how widespread these extreme magical remedies were versus more conventional herbalism and practical medicine, while striking in their description. Such practices might have been sensationalized or less common than the daily use of herbs and basic surgical techniques. So, as you drift into a peaceful slumber, let your mind wander through the strange and often terrifying world of ancient remedies. The bitter herbs, the crude instruments, the desperate prayers, and the horrifying procedures were the only tools against a relentless tide of sickness. The sterile environments, the effective medications, and the compassionate care of modern medicine are truly miraculous advancements. A stark contrast to a time when hope for healing was often mixed with profound horror and agonizing uncertainty. You close your eyes and the flickering lights of ancient sick rooms fade, replaced by the dimly lit interiors of a Roman physician's study or the crude tent of a battlefield surgeon. You are now contemplating the doctor's dilemma, the limited tools, the precarious standing, and the often agonizing choices faced by ancient healers. Navigating a world where disease was a mystery and true cure was often beyond their grasp. This wasn't a profession of undeniable authority and scientific certainty. It was a blend of observation, philosophy, guesswork, and often sheer desperation. Imagine yourself as an ancient physician. You have no understanding of germs, no knowledge of sterile technique, and no diagnostic tools beyond your five senses, and perhaps a basic understanding of anatomy gleaned from observing injuries, or, if you were lucky, dissecting animals or executed criminals. Your examination of a patient is largely based on observation the color of their skin, the state of their tongue, the smell of their breath, the regularity of their pulse if you could feel it effectively. You might examine their urine or feces for clues, trying to discern the imbalance of humors that you believe is causing the illness. This is not precision medicine. It's an educated, albeit often misguided, art of deduction. Your primary tools are crude by modern standards. For surgery, you might have bronze or iron scalpels, forceps, bone drills, and saws, often beautifully crafted but entirely unsterilized. Imagine the grim ritual of heating an instrument in an open flame, not to kill germs, but perhaps to purify it or simply to make it more malleable. Your knowledge of pain management is limited to opium, mandrake, or alcohol, effective for sedation, but far from modern anesthesia, often leaving patients in agony or dangerously unconscious. Infection, for any invasive procedure, is an almost certainty, often leading to a slower, more agonizing death than the original ailment. A surgeon's success was often measured by the speed with which they could operate, minimizing the duration of conscious pain for the patient, rather than the long-term outcome. Your social standing as a doctor could be highly precarious, in ancient Rome, for instance. Greek physicians, despite their considerable knowledge, were sometimes viewed with suspicion or disdain by the Roman elite, seen as foreigners or even charlatans, while some doctors became wealthy and respected, particularly those attached to powerful households or the military. Others struggled to make a living, vying with folk healers, magicians, and quacks. Your reputation was everything. A few failed treatments could ruin your practice. Imagine trying to build a career in a world where your every treatment was a visible, high-stakes gamble with human life, and your failures were often public knowledge, the philosophical underpinnings of ancient medicine. particularly the Hippocratic school in Greece, were groundbreaking for their time. Hippocrates emphasized observation, clinical examination, and the belief that illness had natural rather than supernatural causes. He advocated for a holistic approach, considering diet, environment, and lifestyle. This was a radical departure from earlier belief systems. However, the Hippocratic emphasis on the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, ultimately limited true progress. Every diagnosis and every treatment revolved around rebalancing these humors, leading to practices like extensive bloodletting, purging, and inducing sweating or vomiting. Imagine confidently prescribing blood-draining leeches for a patient already weakened by fever, convinced you are restoring their balance. This demonstrates the confidence that could emerge even from a flawed theoretical framework. In ancient Egypt, medical practitioners were highly specialized, often focusing on particular parts of the body or types of ailments. Some of the earliest specialists in history. You had eye doctors, dentists, even proctologists. Their knowledge was codified in medical papyri, detailing thousands of remedies and procedures. While some of these show surprising anatomical knowledge from mummification practices, they were still operating without a germ theory, meaning even their advanced surgical interventions often led to infection. Imagine visiting an Egyptian dental surgeon, skilled enough to perform complex tooth extractions or even rudimentary fillings, but whose instruments were far from sterile. The Roman approach to medicine, while heavily influenced by the Greeks, also focused on public health measures as much as individual treatment. The construction of aqueducts, sewers, and public baths, while not understood in terms of germ theory, did inadvertently improve public sanitation in cities. Military medicine was also highly organized, with army doctors and field hospitals, demonstrating a practical understanding that keeping soldiers healthy was crucial for maintaining imperial power. Imagine being a Roman legionary, injured in battle, and receiving care in a field hospital, a rare instance of institutionalized medical attention in the ancient world, though still fraught with risks. One fascinating, often overlooked aspect is the role of diet and exercise in ancient medicine. Many ancient physicians, particularly the Greeks and Romans, emphasized the importance of a balanced diet, regular exercise, and moderation in all things as key to maintaining health and preventing illness. This holistic approach, while not rooted in modern nutritional science, was a surprisingly astute observation about lifestyle's impact on well-being. They understood that poor eating habits or a sedentary life could contribute to various ailments, a common truth that transcends millennia. Historians still debate the extent to which ancient health advice was followed by the general populace versus being largely a concern for the elite. While the philosophical and medical texts emphasize healthy living, the harsh realities of poverty and necessity likely meant that many simply ate what they could get and worked themselves to exhaustion. So, as you drift into a peaceful slumber, reflect on the immense challenges faced by ancient healers, their limited tools, their flawed theories, and their constant battle against an unseen enemy made their profession a truly heroic, yet often tragically ineffective endeavor. The precision, the diagnostic power, and the life-saving treatments of modern medicine are truly astounding achievements. Born from centuries of incremental progress, built upon the foundations, however shaky, laid by these dedicated ancient practitioners, you close your eyes and the flickering lights of ancient sick rooms fade, replaced by the vast, decaying shadow of an empire. You are now witnessing Rome's rotting empire, observing how disease, far from being a mere footnote, contributed significantly to the gradual unraveling of a superpower, weakening its legions, crippling its economy, and eroding the very fabric of its society. This wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic fall, but a slow, agonizing decline. Much of it fueled by invisible biological forces that the Romans, for all their engineering genius, simply could not understand or control. Imagine the mighty Roman legions, the backbone of the empire, renowned for their discipline and strength. Now envision them ravaged by disease, not just in distant, exotic lands, but even within their fortified camps. Campaigns would be halted not by enemy swords, but by outbreaks of dysentery, malaria, or typhoid that decimated their ranks more effectively than any barbarian horde. Soldiers, weakened by recurrent fevers or chronic infections, would be less effective in battle, prone to exhaustion, and more susceptible to injury. The Antonine Plague, as we touched upon earlier, is a prime example, carried back by victorious legions from the east. It swept through the military, killing an estimated 1/4 to 1/3 of the Roman army. Imagine the profound psychological impact on the survivors, seeing their comrades fall to an unseen enemy, a force more terrifying than any human foe. This constant drain on manpower, the difficulty of recruiting new soldiers, and the weakening of existing forces directly impacted Rome's ability to defend its vast and porous borders, making it vulnerable to external threats. Beyond the military, disease had a devastating impact on the Roman economy. Cities, the vibrant centers of trade and production, would be hit hard by epidemics. As people died or became too sick to work, labor shortages became acute. Fields would go unplowed, harvests uncollected, and workshops would fall silent. Trade routes, the very arteries of the empire's wealth, would be disrupted as fear of contagion led to blockades and abandonment. Imagine the bustling port of Ostia, a lifeline for Rome, suddenly quiet as ships feared docking, or goods rotting on wharves. The economic disruption led to soaring prices, food shortages, and widespread poverty, fueling discontent and instability. The very taxes that funded the empire would dwindle as the population shrank and economic activity ground to a halt. The Roman fascination with urban living, while a hallmark of their civilization, also made them incredibly vulnerable. Their large, densely packed cities, despite impressive aqueducts and some sewage systems, were still hotbeds of disease transmission. The close quarters, the constant influx of people from diverse regions, and the limits of ancient sanitation meant that any introduced pathogen could spread like wildfire. Imagine Rome, a city of 1 million people, a perfect incubator for infectious diseases, turning its own citizens against themselves. While the wealthy might have had access to cleaner water and private baths, the vast majority of the urban poor lived in squalid conditions, sharing crowded tenements, reliant on communal water sources that were often contaminated. The empire's reliance on slavery also played a complex role. Large numbers of enslaved people, often captured from diverse regions, would be transported across the empire, potentially bringing new diseases with them, living in cramped, unhygienic conditions. Enslaved populations were particularly vulnerable to epidemics, and their illness or death represented a direct economic loss for their owners. While their forced labor was essential to the Roman economy, it also created massive pools of disease vectors. Imagine a crowded slave ship, a floating petri dish, bringing new strains of illness to every port it touched. The cumulative effect of these repeated epidemics was a significant demographic decline. Over centuries, continuous outbreaks of plague, smallpox, malaria, and other endemic diseases led to a gradual decrease in the Roman population. This wasn't just a matter of numbers. It meant fewer farmers to grow food, fewer soldiers to fight, fewer artisans to produce goods, and fewer people to pay taxes. Imagine an empire slowly shrinking from within, its vibrancy fading as generations were culled by unseen killers. This demographic decline created a vicious cycle, as a smaller population meant less resilience, making the empire even more vulnerable to the next wave of disease or external threat. The psychological and social impact was equally profound. Trust in traditional authorities, whether political or religious, would erode as they proved powerless against the invisible enemy. people might become increasingly superstitious, seeking solace in new cults or abandoning traditional gods altogether. Moral codes could break down in the face of mass death and despair, leading to widespread hedonism or, conversely, extreme asceticism. The very bonds that held Roman society together would fray. Imagine the fear and paranoia as people became suspicious of strangers, of merchants, even of their own neighbors, seeing them as potential carriers of death. Historians still debate the relative importance of disease versus other factors' economic woes. Military overstretch, political instability in the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, while no single factor was solely responsible. The overwhelming evidence suggests that repeated waves of devastating disease acted as a relentless, corrosive force, weakening the empire's ability to withstand other pressures and ultimately contributing significantly to its fragmentation and eventual collapse. So, as you drift into a peaceful slumber, let the image of Rome's slow, agonizing decline settle in your mind. It wasn't just barbarians at the gates, or economic mismanagement, or political infighting. It was the relentless, silent march of disease, an invisible enemy that chipped away at the empire's foundations, proving that even the most formidable power can be brought to its knees by the smallest. Unseen forces. It's a sobering reminder that the health of a population is inextricably linked to the strength and resilience of its civilization. You close your eyes, and the final. Lingering images of Rome's decline fade into the deep quiet of your room. You are no longer in the ancient world, but perched on the precipice of time. Looking back, tonight, you'll feel the echoes of epidemics past. Reflecting on the terrifying scourges that once ravaged humanity, and the profound medical miracles that now safeguard your existence. This is not just a historical account, it's a journey into gratitude. A quiet acknowledgement of how far we've truly come from a time when sickness was an inescapable, often fatal mystery. Imagine, for a moment, the sheer, unimaginable terror of ancient life. Every cough, every fever, every ache carried a weight that is almost impossible for you to comprehend today. There was no scientific explanation for why a healthy child suddenly wasted away, why an entire city could be gripped by agonizing boils, or why a mysterious illness could leave you paralyzed and disfigured. The invisible enemy was everywhere, striking indiscriminately, and leaving behind a trail of death and despair. The best minds of the time attributed these calamities to angry gods, malicious spirits, or cosmic imbalances. You lived with a constant, gnawing anxiety, knowing that at any moment your own life, or the lives of those you loved, could be snatched away by an unseen force with no hope of cure. Think of the lack of control in the face of devastating plagues. Ancient societies had no effective public health measures. They couldn't sterilize water, couldn't develop vaccines, couldn't produce antibiotics. Their attempts at quarantine were often rudimentary and ineffective. When a plague hit, the only recourse was often prayer, desperate flight, or a grim acceptance of fate. Imagine living in a city where bodies piled up faster than they could be buried, where the air reeked of death, and where the living were too terrified or too sick to even mourn their dead. This overwhelming feeling of powerlessness, of being utterly at the mercy of forces beyond human comprehension, is perhaps the most profound echo from these ancient scourges. Now, contrast that chilling reality with your present. The very air you breathe, the water you drink, the food you eat, all are subject to standards of hygiene and safety unimaginable to the ancients. A simple cut, once a potential gateway to fatal infection, is now easily treated with antiseptic and a bandage. A fever, once a harbinger of doom, can often be swiftly diagnosed and treated with medication. The diseases that once wiped out entire populations, smallpox, polio, diphtheria, measles, are now largely, if not entirely, preventable through vaccines, a miracle of modern science. Imagine trying to explain a vaccine to an ancient Roman or Greek, a tiny injection that prevents a deadly disease. It would be seen as magic or divine intervention, utterly beyond their comprehension. The advancements in understanding the human body are equally staggering. From the ancient theories of humors and miasma, we've moved to the intricate understanding of genetics, cellular biology, and microbiology. We know about bacteria, viruses, and parasites. We understand how they spread, how they cause disease, and how to fight them. Doctors today have diagnostic tools that allow them to peer inside the body, to pinpoint the exact nature of an illness, and to deliver targeted treatments that save countless lives every day. Imagine the sheer wonder an ancient healer would feel if they could see an MRI scan, or witness a successful surgery performed under sterile conditions with anesthesia. Even in terms of mental health, we have come light years. While imperfections remain, modern psychiatry and psychology offer frameworks for understanding mental anguish, providing therapies, and developing medications that can alleviate suffering. The idea of acknowledging trauma, of providing support for mental illness rather than seeing it as demonic possession or divine punishment, represents a profound shift in human empathy and scientific understanding. This journey from fear and superstition to knowledge and compassion is one of humanity's greatest achievements. However, the echoes of the past also serve as a crucial reminder of our continued vulnerability. Despite all our advancements, new pathogens can still emerge, and existing diseases can evolve. Climate change, global travel, and societal inequalities can still create conditions ripe for outbreaks. The ancient world's experiences remind us of the fragility of even the most advanced societies when confronted with a truly devastating pandemic. They teach us the importance of public health, scientific research, and global cooperation in safeguarding our collective well-being. Historians still debate whether modern society, despite its scientific prowess, truly grasps the historical impact of disease and remains susceptible to complacency. The rapid response to recent pandemics shows progress, but the constant threat demands continued vigilance. So, as you finally drift into the deepest, most peaceful slumber, let the stark contrast between then and now truly sink in. The horrifying illnesses of the ancient world were a constant companion, a terrifying threat that shaped every aspect of life and death. The world you inhabit today, with its unseen protections and medical marvels, is a testament to centuries of quiet, relentless human progress, a profound victory over the forces of disease. Rest now, truly appreciating the immense gift of modern health, a luxury that your ancient counterparts could only dream of.